As some of you may know, I am a lawyer. The art of a courtroom lawyer is the art of telling stories. Yuval Noah Harari postulates that mankind's ability to tell, listen to, and act upon stories is what separates it from other animals. Recently, he wrote in The Guardian that nations are built on stories. He said, nations are ultimately built on stories. Each passing day adds more stories that Ukrainians will tell not only in the dark days ahead, but in the decades and generations to come. The president who refused to flee the capital, telling the US that he needed ammunition and not a ride. He was talking of how President Zelensky in the Ukraine created a story that bound a nation in defiance against a much bigger neighbor. This got me thinking about the story of the Indian nation and its constitution in India's 75th year of independence. Very few people know how inextricably intertwined is the story of Jamia University and the story of India's emergence as an educated country. As you all know, Jamia began in 1921 primarily as a university created by nationalist Muslims who sought to create an institution of excellence. Despite its struggle in its early years, it came to be ranked as one of the foremost universities of India of those days. But as its silver jubilee came around in 1946, the nation itself was in the throes of great communal violence. On November 17, 1946, at the silver jubilee function of the university, its vice chancellor Dr. Zakir Hussain was flanked by two future prime ministers and two future governors general. On the one side were Muhammad Ali Jinnah and Liaquat Ali Khan, and on the other side were Pandit Nehru and C. Rajgopalachari. Direct Action Day had happened only a few months earlier in June 1946. The great Calcutta killings had seen over 4,000 people being killed and many more injured. Dr. Zakir Hussain reminded the leaders on both sides, "You are all stars of the political firmament. There is love and respect for you not only in thousands, but also in millions of hearts. I wish to take advantage of your presence here to convey to you, with the deepest of sorrow, the sentiments of those engaged in educational work. The fire of mutual hatred which is ablaze in this country makes our work of laying out and tending gardens appear as sheer madness. These words may appear harsh to you, but the harshest words would be too mild to describe the conditions that prevail around us. We are obliged by the demands of our own vocation to cultivate reverence for children. How shall I tell you of the anguish we suffer when we hear that in the upsurge of brutality, even innocent children are not spared? For God's sake, put your heads together and extinguish this fire. This is not the time to investigate and determine who lighted this fire, how it was lighted. The fire is blazing. It has to be put out. It's not a question of the survival of this nation or that nation. It is a question of choosing between civilized human life and the savagery of wild beasts. For God's sake, do not allow the very foundation of civilized life in this country to be destroyed as they are now being destroyed." This story may be somewhat familiar to the Jamia family, but it is unknown to most of India. If we ponder on the stories of the two nations that were soon created thereafter, we will perceive that India wrote a constitution in about 2 years, and Pakistan adopted its constitution 26 years later, after it had been divided into Pakistan and Bangladesh. Moving back a little, an undivided India had elections to the Constituent Assembly in July 1946. For the first few months, the Constituent Assembly merely gathered materials because the future, including the proposed partition of India, was not very clear. It was only in June 1947 that detailed plans for partition were revealed by Lord Mountbatten and the members of the Constituent Assembly, who were elected from the territories which would go to form the new country of Pakistan, became members of the first Constituent Assembly of Pakistan. This Constituent Assembly of Pakistan could not adopt a constitution and was dissolved by the Governor General, Ghulam Muhammad, on October 24, 1954. After several attempts at adopting a permanent constitution failed, Pakistan adopted its first permanent constitution on 14th August 1973, only after its breakup into Pakistan and Bangladesh. On this side, on the Indian side, the remaining members of India's Constituent Assembly went on to create a document that is one of the largest constitutions in the world. They were guided by Dr. Ambedkar, who had been elected from a constituency that had gone to the new state of Pakistan, which is now in Bangladesh. He thus had to be re-elected from a seat in the Bombay province. As head of the drafting committee of the constitution, he guided the assembly to come up with a foundational document for a new nation. He told the Constituent Assembly, let us leave aside slogans. Let us leave aside words that frighten people. Let us even make a concession to the prejudices of our opponents. Bring them in so that they may willingly join us on marching upon that road which, as I said, if we talk long enough, must necessarily lead us to unity. Thus, our constitution makers made deliberate choices on very divisive issues: universal adult voting, the protection of minority rights, freedom of speech and religion and conscience, and the Supreme Court that every Indian could resort to, were ideas that may not have found easy acceptance. Yet, they were deliberate choices made by the Constituent Assembly, which consisted in large part of orthodox Hindus, with the President of the Assembly, Dr. Rajendra Prasad, being the most orthodox of them. It was thus a nearly 80% majority of orthodox Hindus who made deliberate choices and compromises. The reason for those choices was that the Constitution was created against a backdrop of horrific violence which had been caused because that generation had made the wrong choice of populism, majoritarianism, and groupthink. If you recollect the 1940s, you had the horrors of the Jewish Holocaust, the Second World War, the atomic bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki, the partition violence which cost over 1 million lives, and above all, the murder of the father of the nation by a majoritarian fanatic. It was against this backdrop that consensus decisions were being made to avoid majoritarian consensus and to build in such protections for all minorities based on linguistic, language, culture, so that they could all take their place as free and equal citizens of an independent nation. The Israeli political scientist Hannah Lerner, in her book Making Constitutions in Deeply Divided Societies, called the Indian process constructive ambiguity. She notes that the achievement of the Indian Constitution is that by refraining from resolving certain contentious issues in a clear and decisive manner, it succeeded in creating strong institutional structures which helped preserve democratic order despite the continuing tensions around foundational aspects of the Constitution, despite the fact that India is more culturally and linguistically diverse than other stable democracies. The democratic form of government is supported by the overwhelming majority of Indians across diverse communities. And thus, when we, the people of India, gave ourselves a constitution on November 26, 1949, it assured the dignity of the individual. We solemnly resolved to treat each other as equal partners in the building and maintenance of a great nation. The Constitution of India is not a mere rule book, a mere document of do's and don'ts. It is a social compact and a collective contract under which all Indians live and decide how the nation will run. Through 72 years of its existence, the Constitution has transformed a ravaged country into a stable and largely intact modernizing nation. But while we can quietly savor our achievements so far, let us also remember that eternal vigilance is the price of liberty. In 1944, at the height of the Second World War, the great American judge, Justice Learned Hand, warned. I often wonder whether we do not rest our hopes too much upon constitutions, upon laws, and upon courts. These are false hopes, believe me, these are false hopes. Liberty lies in the hearts of men and women. When it dies there, no constitution, no law, no court can even do much to help it. While it lives there, it needs no constitution, no law, no court to save it. I have thus told you the story of the framing of the Indian Constitution. I pray that the spirit of liberty and independence may forever live in free India, that successive generations of Indians continue to cherish, protect, live, and work with our enduring Constitution. Jai Hind.